Alphabet is looking to move production out of China, and that's very important because it follows a very interesting trend of the US and China decoupling, and so we're going to break that down in this video. So guys, as you smash that like button, let me run the intro. What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. Let's dive right into this one because I have highlighted Apple as a riskier stock based on its valuation, and now we're seeing some other interesting developments come from Apple. So as we dive into it, notice that the Wall Street Journal did put out an article where they're saying that Apple is actually planning to move production out of China. And so what exactly are they talking about? What exactly is going on here? So you can see here that they're saying that in recent weeks, Apple has actually accelerated its plans to shift some of its production outside of China, which has long been the place where Apple produced much of its cell phones. And guys, take this whole video with a grain of salt because notice that the Wall Street Journal does say that this is coming from people involved in the discussion, so essentially unnamed sources. So just be weary of that whenever you see it. And it looks like the countries where they're looking to offshore are India and Vietnam. However, I personally do believe that India and Vietnam do pose their risks themselves. And stick around to the later part of this video. I'm going to discuss the risks of Apple moving into manufacturing in Vietnam and India. And effectively what's happening is the article essentially describes it as coming after a year of events that weaken China's status as a stable manufacturing center. There looks like the upheavals as a result of their zero COVID policy, which impacted their supply chain, is causing companies like Apple to really consider about globally diversifying their supply chain. And so although in the past they didn't necessarily focus so much on supply chains, I think those days are over, and it's now a significant advantage to have sort of like a variable supply chain. And I have spoken to you guys on this channel about one company here in Canada that actually got lucky because of the supply chain issues, and that company is Canada Goose, where I think it's somewhere around 80% of their coats are manufactured in Canada, and so they were able to continue producing and selling coats and not having to worry about any sort of like supply chain weaknesses, shortages of product, or purchasing more than they needed to because they were worried about future issues with the supply chain and then ending up with an inventory glut. And this is what I mean about a potential inventory glut. In fact, we're on the opposite spectrum of that right now. Notice in 2020, the wait time for iPhones on the launch week is pretty standard. Like you'd always expect a wait time in the launch week, which is fine, although the wait time was much less than it is currently. But notice 10 weeks after sales have started, the wait time was pretty much minimal, a couple of days, that's all. Now look at the top of that chart. For the iPhone 14, the wait time 10 weeks after the launch of the phone are still pretty much in line with the wait time at launch week. And so it really shows you how weak the production for this phone is, and it shows you how long people are waiting as a result. And so there's a real issue here, and part of it, of course, you guys know, is just because of the slowdowns and the lockdowns and the zero COVID policies, especially at the Foxconn plant. And so how do they deal with it? Well, they have to globally diversify their supply chain, but there's risks involved with that. And you can see here it was reported that Apple has told its manufacturing partners that it wants them to start to do more of its work outside of China. But the problem there, and what I'll continue to harp on, is the fact that Apple and China have spent decades trying to sort of like tie themselves together. One, I don't think this change happens overnight. But two, I don't think they want this change to happen overnight either, and I'll get into that in a second. And of course, it looks like Apple's longer term goal is to ship 40% to 45% of its iPhones from India compared to just the single digit percentage currently being done, according to Ming Chi Kuo, an analyst at TF International Securities who follows the supply chain. And of course, there's two reasons why this change is being driven. The first one, of course, is that there are some Chinese youth that are no longer eager to work for modest wages assembling electronics for the affluent. I understand that, as the company sort of embraces sort of like the middle class as they continue to get wealthier, the cheaper jobs or the lower wage jobs are going to start going away. Less and less people are going to want to do them. And so global manufacturers are going to have to diversify away to places where they are still going to be willing to manufacture for that wage rate. But of course, that causes issues for China. The second issue is that, and I think this is the main issue, which is the fact that they've been in COVID-19 lockdowns for 3 years now. And of course, what I mean by that is that it's not that these lockdowns have been pervasive throughout the 3 years. Not everything has been locked down for 3 years, but the threat of lockdowns has been really challenging, especially for the consumer market as well out there. And this is in spite of the fact that many countries have returned to their pre-pandemic norms. But I really think Apple needs to be very careful and consider this very strongly. And I'm sure they already have, like, there's smarter people there than, of course, I am. But if you're manufacturing away from China, think about how it impacts your relationships of selling phones in China. And if you guys don't think that that's an issue, take a look at this next chart. Notice how large their sales volume is in China. $80 billion of sales revenue is expected to come from China this year. And so selling iPhones in China is a big part of Apple's future growth prospects. So they will have to be careful here and manage the political ramifications of moving production away from China carefully. And I think that there's a bigger story developing here. Notice that the survey of US-China Business Council this year found American companies' confidence in China has fallen to a record low. And that's something that I have been warning about for at least a year now. So now it's starting to get reported in other newspapers other than just like the South China Morning Post, which is what I originally I believe I found it in. But notice that part of the reason why confidence is going down is because the country continues to operate using COVID-19 measures. Now, recently they have walked away or sort of like stepped back their COVID-19 sort of protocols as there's been a lot of pressure from the population through protests. So we'll see how this continues, but I always tell you guys, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So I am not going all in or increasing my position in Alibaba in any way, shape, or form. I'm waiting for this to roll out completely. I'm waiting for them to declare victory on COVID, and I'm waiting for those mRNA vaccines to get rolled out, at least to their most vulnerable population. None of that has happened yet, so I'm not celebrating as much as other people are right now, and you're seeing that celebration happen with the share price for Alibaba and other Chinese names surging in the last couple of days. And something interesting that a lot of people aren't aware of is to keep operating during government COVID-19 measures, a company like Foxconn had to seal their smoking areas, switched off their vending machines, and closed dining halls in favor of carry-out meals that workers bring back to their dorms after a half-hour walk away. And so what this is causing is it's causing workers to sort of try and escape Foxconn. They're jumping fences, walking along empty highways to get back to their hometowns. And so that doesn't seem like these people are voluntary workers. And I'm sure there's a lot more that I'm not covering there. And guys, let us know in the comments below. We always love to hear from you guys that the larger story that's going on here. And so the point that I'm making is that many of those abandoning the factories have been young workers, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, who are saying on social media that their wages that are equivalent to around $5 or less per hour were not enough to compensate for the tedious production work exacerbated by COVID-19 restrictions. And so is this a lying low phenomenon where people are only willing to work for higher wages, or is this a situation that they're just not willing to tolerate the COVID-19 restrictions put on to them? I don't really know the answer. Let me know in the comments, guys. But with that said, it's not like it's easier to produce outside of China. There's problems with Vietnam and India. And so let's start with Vietnam. So notice that the article actually talked about this, and I'm glad that they did, that Vietnam's manufacturing, although is growing quickly, is very short of workers. The country has just under 100 million people, which is less than a tenth of China's population. So they can't handle a 60,000 person manufacturing site like China can. Additionally, it doesn't look like India or Vietnam are going to be doing high-end phones. No other places can do high-end phones other than China at the moment. Now, we are starting to push the production of high-end chips domestically in North America, but I still think the assembly of those chips will still have to happen in China. So just because we're producing the chips in North America doesn't necessarily mean that those chips don't inevitably go to China to get produced. Now, how do you deal with that issue? Because then you're still sending high-end chips to China despite having the CHIP Act. So I don't know how you deal with that. And when it comes to India, India also has its individual problems. India has a population of nearly the size of China, but not the same level of governmental coordination. Apple has actually found it hard to navigate India because each state is run differently, and regional governments saddle the company with obligations before letting it build products there. And so in other words, they're saying in this article that operating in India or trying to manufacturing in India is essentially working in what many would consider sort of like the wild, wild west of commerce at the moment. You might get lucky and you might not. But the other issue is that Apple has recently been in the hot seat for how they treated or how they sort of navigated the protests in China. And if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, take a look at this article. So Apple has recently actually been in the hot seat for actions taken during the China protests. And really what was happening is that people were getting angry at Apple because they were limiting the ability for protesters to use airdrop. And so that was pretty interesting And, some people are saying that Apple is doing the bidding of the Chinese government, and so you can't rely on corporations to act ethically when they're overseas. Now, I don't have a position on that. It's hard for me to determine what caused the airdrop issue to happen, but it looks like these people do have a leg to stand on based on what's being reported. Now, once again, you guys know this better than I do, and so let me know in the comments what you think is happening with sort of like that airdrop situation, or at least what has happened with it. Is it a situation of Apple complying with government regulations or government sort of like strong-arming them into doing it, or was there sort of like a glitch in the systems? You guys let me know. But overall, when you're moving away production into friendlier territories, that really is called friendshoring. And I actually have a video on friendshoring, which I will link to at the end of this video. But for those of you who are new to the channel, I know a lot of you guys are new to the channel, what exactly is friendshoring? Well, notice that there was an article posted on LinkedIn, and so you guys can find this article, but Senate Janet Yellen remarks on at least the 13th of April that friendshoring is a commitment to work with countries that have a strong adherence to a set of norms and values about how to operate in the global economy and how to run the global economic system. So essentially, doing business with friends. So in other words, friendshoring or ally shoring has become a means for the US to influence firms to move their sourcing and manufacturing sites to friendly shores. And of course, as you guys may imagine, friendshoring can actually be risky. Friendshoring can actually disrupt the already unstable global supply chain. And the other issue is, and what I described previously in this video, is that other Asian countries may not have the complete infrastructure to facilitate manufacturing in some industries. So in my opinion, I think China will still remain the manufacturing powerhouse for the world, as it's just easier to do business there. And if they see more and more companies moving away from China, you can absolutely bet that they're going to create concessions and make deals to make sure that companies don't walk away. And so, although this is a new form of protectionism, I don't think it will be conducive to globalizations, and it will impact the global supply chain and our economies. And in the long term, I do believe that friendshoring could backfire if the country that you rely on for example, lithium batteries or precious metal for computer chips, etc., feels alienated. So once again, I always say this, is that I know that there's a lot of push for an anti-globalized movement right now. I understand it, but be careful and understand exactly what the repercussions of that can and potentially could be. Now, with that said, what exactly does Apple's valuation look like in this environment? And I want to walk you through the model that the Patreons get access to at that lower tier, just $5 a month, which essentially is just the equivalent of buying me a couple of coffees for getting access to all of my research. You can see here that there is a huge slowdown in Apple's revenue. So this is their revenue for all of their segments going from 2015 to 2022. Notice how much their services segment has slowed down. It grew by 14.2% last year when they originally had a CAGR of 32.2%. So if you're going to forecast out revenue for Apple, you got to make a point that the iPhone is not going to provide them huge growth. The Mac isn't going to provide them with exceptional levels of growth. Neither is the iPad or wearables. It has been a services segment driven story. And so if the services is declining, which you can see in my forecast, I'm actually declining it down to a growth of 7.5% a year. You can only expect revenue growing at around 5% for that top line consolidated into the long term, or the medium term, and then going into the long term. And I'm keeping their margins high. So, a 40% gross margin is pretty healthy. But what exactly does that do for their valuation? So you can see that using a terminal multiple of 15 times earning, which some of you might argue is a little bit low, I'm actually forecasting them to be valued at approximately $108 per share. So call it $110 to be even. Well, if you look at their current share price, which is approximately $150 per share, then you can see that the share price is pretty rich as a percentage of their intrinsic value. So the question is Apple an investment right now? I don't think so. I think Apple is a little bit overvalued, and it could potentially be reaching significantly overvalued if it goes even higher in its share price. So this is a name that I'm staying away from. And if they start offshoring products and producing them in areas which brings their margins further lower, because of course China's probably the least expensive area to manufacture. So when you leave China, it's probably more expensive to manufacture these products anyways, then Can you pass those costs over to the consumers? I think you probably could to an extent, but you could also run into risk. So it's not a stock that I'm willing to take a risk on. I'm not going to be interested in Apple until the shares are $50 per share or lower. And that means I might never be a buyer of Apple. We'll see what the share price provides to us. But let me know what you guys think about this opportunity. Let me know in the comments. And of course, if you guys haven't seen that video where I document friendshoring and talk about all the implications of friendshoring, take a look at this video right here where I have it linked.